He was just a gardener. Quiet, focused, and never stayed longer than he had to. But something changed the day it rained, and I realized maybe I wasn't the only one who had been waiting for something to bloom. The morning air was thick with dew, and the sunlight filtered gently through the branches of the old trees that lined the back of the property. Elliot Marlowe stood by the kitchen window, a steaming mug of black coffee in hand, watching as the new gardener worked in silence near the rose bushes. The man's movements were purposeful, steady. There was a grace to the way he moved, even while pulling stubborn weeds from the earth. Elliot didn't usually watch people. He preferred solitude, quiet mornings filled with books, and the dependable click of his typewriter. But something about this man, Javier, that was his name, drew his attention. It had been years since anyone had worked the garden properly. After his husband passed, the flower beds had withered, the hedges grew wild, and the gravel paths disappeared beneath moss and neglect. He hadn't expected someone like Javier. The agency had sent him without much introduction, just a brief note about his experience and a recommendation from one of Elliot's distant neighbors. When Javier arrived, tan skin, dark hair curling beneath a worn cap, quiet eyes that seemed to take in everything without asking questions, Elliot had only offered a few instructions and a nod. That had been enough. 3 days had passed since then. Javier arrived early each morning, well before Elliot finished his first cup of coffee, and worked until the sun was directly overhead. He barely spoke, only offering a polite greeting before getting to work. There was a certain comfort in that, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Elliot noticed the small changes first. The dead branches of the pear tree had been trimmed. The ivy that once crept up the back wall had been cut back with care, revealing the aged stone beneath. A section of the garden that had been lost to overgrowth now looked like it might someday resemble its former shape. Standing at the window, Elliot sipped his coffee, his eyes following Javier's steady progress along the old stone path. He didn't fully understand why he kept watching. Maybe it was because the garden had once been a place of comfort, or maybe it was because the sight of someone tending to it again stirred something in him, something quiet and warm and unfamiliar. He told himself it was just appreciation, admiration for a job done well. But still, he found himself opening the door and stepping outside. The air smelled of earth and clipped rosemary. A light breeze stirred the leaves overhead, casting dappled shadows on the lawn. Javier looked up briefly as Elliot approached, nodding once before turning back to his work. Elliot said nothing. He walked the path slowly, trailing his hand along the top of the low brick wall as he passed. The warmth of the sun against his back felt different that day, softer somehow. He stopped a few feet from where Javier knelt beside the roses, silently noting the way the man's hands moved with deliberate care, brushing soil from the base of the plant as if it were something precious. It had been a long time since Elliot had shared space with someone so quietly, not out of obligation or conversation, but simply by being. There was no need to explain himself, no pressure to fill the silence. That in itself felt like a gift. Javier stood eventually, brushing the dirt for his hands. He reached for a small metal watering can and walked toward the edge of the garden. Elliot watched him move, the easy confidence in his stride, the way his presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt strangely like home. When Javier passed by him, their eyes met briefly. There was no exchange of words, just the faintest suggestion of acknowledgement. It was enough. The rest of the day drifted by in fragments. Elliot returned inside, sat at his desk, and tried to write. But his thoughts kept returning to the garden, to the man working beneath the trees. The rhythm of the typewriter keys felt different beneath his fingers, like something had shifted. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Elliot stood again by the window. Javier was packing up his tools, the light catching the curve of his cheekbone, the edge of his jaw. Elliot realized then that the silence of the house no longer felt as comfortable as it once had. It felt lonely. That night, as Elliot read in bed, he found himself listening to the sounds of the garden settling into sleep. The rustle of branches, the distant call of a bird, the soft brush of wind against the shutters. And beneath it all, a strange, quiet anticipation. He didn't know what it was or what it meant, but he knew that for the first time in a long while, he was curious. Curious enough to stay. Curious enough to hope. Curious enough to wonder what might grow next. The following week unfolded slowly, each day carrying a subtle shift in the rhythm of Elliot's quiet life. The mornings began the same. Coffee at the window, watching Javier arrive with his usual quiet stride and basket of tools. Yet something intangible had changed, like the garden itself was breathing differently. Elliot spent more time outside now. He had no specific reason, no need to supervise or assist, but the air felt easier in the garden, softer than the silence inside his home. He began taking long walks along the perimeter, following Javier's progress with quiet observation. The once-forgotten corner by the stone bench had been cleared of dead foliage. Ferns now curved gently along the path, and the first hints of green budded along the bare hydrangea branches. It wasn't just the garden that was waking. One afternoon, the wind stirred stronger than usual, rustling the tops of the pear tree with a dry whisper. Elliot had stepped out to see how things were going and noticed Javier standing beneath the large tree, one hand resting on its trunk, the other holding a pair of pruning shears. The moment was still, almost reverent. Elliot said nothing, but he knew that the tree meant something now. It had survived storms, disease, and years of neglect. Yet it still bore leaves, still reached toward the light. Somehow, it reminded him of himself. Javier looked over his shoulder and offered the faintest smile, not out of politeness, but something gentler, more personal. There was no need for words, only the shared recognition of something being quietly restored. Later that day, Elliot returned to the garden with 2 glasses of water. He found Javier kneeling near the herb bed, replanting what had once been a sprawling mess of thyme and oregano. Elliot placed one of the glasses on the low wall nearby. He didn't need to announce it. He simply left it there, and Javier would find it. It was a small offering, a gesture made not out of obligation, but quiet thoughtfulness. When Javier reached for the glass some time later, their eyes met again. This time, Elliot held the gaze for a second longer. Still, no words passed between them. By Thursday, the weather warmed, and the garden seemed to hum with anticipation. The bees returned to the lavender. A few early roses opened their delicate petals. Elliot sat on a weathered bench beneath the arbor, a book resting on his lap, unread. His attention drifted toward Javier, who worked a few yards away near a cluster of old stone planters. There was an easy grace to the way he moved, deliberate, steady, unhurried. At one point, Javier reached up to wipe the sweat from his brow, his shirt lifting slightly, revealing the curve of his back. Elliot looked away quickly, but the image remained, settled somewhere in his chest, heavy and warm. He didn't understand it, not fully. It wasn't lust exactly. It was something older, deeper. A quiet awareness that crept in like sunlight through curtains. A recognition of beauty, of presence, of someone who made the world feel less hollow. They worked in proximity again that afternoon. Javier weeding a border while Elliot trimmed dead leaves from a long-forgotten potted fig tree. Every now and then, their movements brought them closer until they were side by side near the garden wall. Elliot could feel the heat radiating off Javier's skin. The scent of earth, rosemary, and sweat filled the air. Javier reached into a leather pouch, pulled out a pair of gardening gloves, and offered one to Elliot without speaking. It wasn't a demand or an invitation, just a silent acknowledgement that he belonged here too, if he chose to. Elliot accepted it. Together, they cleared the last of the tangled vines, their shoulders brushing only once, but it was enough to leave Elliot's pulse slightly elevated. As they worked, Elliot caught himself smiling, not because of a joke or anything particular, but simply because being there in that moment felt right. The air smelled like rain might come, even though the sky was still clear. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, and Elliot let himself breathe deeper than he had in days. When the task was done, Javier wiped his hands and sat on the low wall. Elliot joined him after a moment, the silence between them thick, but not uncomfortable. They sat there, looking out over the newly cleared garden bed. The earth was dark ready, so it would hold new roots. Elliot glanced sideways. Javier's gaze was fixed on the horizon, calm and focused. There was something about him, something solid and kind and deeply human. In that stillness, Elliot felt a stirring of something he hadn't dared feel in years. Hope. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the stones, Elliot stood slowly and brushed the dust from his trousers. Javier remained seated, his eyes following the movement, but again he said nothing. That night, as Elliot sat at his desk, the garden scent still clung to his skin. He didn't write. Instead, he thought about the way Javier's hands moved through soil, how his quiet presence made the space between moments feel less like waiting and more like becoming. The garden was no longer a place of memory. It was becoming something else entirely, something alive. The day began like the others, wrapped in soft clouds and the subtle scent of early summer. The air was heavier than usual, carrying with it the promise of rain. Elliot noticed it as soon as he stepped outside with his coffee. The birds were quieter, and the light was gentler, diffused through the overcast sky. Javier arrived not long after, wearing his usual work shirt and carrying a smaller toolkit than usual, as if he, too, sensed the weather might shorten the day. He nodded a quiet greeting and headed toward the row of planters near the western edge of the garden, where the old brick path dipped and cracked beneath overgrown roots. Elliot watched him from the back porch, his mug warm in his hands. He had grown used to these mornings, the quiet rhythm of Javier moving through the space, the way his presence filled the silence without disturbing it. There was comfort in it, a kind of companionship that required nothing but acknowledgement. By midday, the air had thickened to the point where even the leaves seemed to hang lower, heavy with anticipation. Thunder rolled distantly, low and slow like a drumbeat far off in the hills. Javier continued working, now near the greenhouse, brushing soil from terracotta pots and tending to the seedlings that had begun to show life. Elliot stepped out, pausing at the top of the garden stairs. There was no need to speak. He simply watched, letting the air settle around them. He had learned not to question why he lingered so often now. There was something grounding about Javier's quiet steadiness, like tending the garden wasn't just a task but a meditation. The first drop of rain fell around 2 o'clock, then another, and then, without warning, the sky opened and poured. Javier stood abruptly, brushing the dirt from his hands. Elliot waved him toward the house, already stepping aside to hold the door open. Within seconds, Javier was on the porch, his shirt damp, droplets running along his forearms. Elliot gestured toward the kitchen with a glance, then turned and began boiling water. He didn't ask if Javier wanted tea. It just felt like the right thing to do. They said nothing as the kettle warmed. The only sounds the ticking of the old wall clock and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Javier stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the downpour soak the garden. Elliot handed him a mug, plain, ceramic warm. Their fingers brushed briefly, and though neither acknowledged it, the moment stretched slightly longer than necessary. They sat on opposite ends of the small kitchen table. Between them, the soft steam from their mugs curled upward, disappearing into the still air. The rain outside had turned the garden into something dreamlike. Mist rising from the warm soil, petals heavy with water, the whole world softened by silver light. It should have felt awkward, but it didn't. Javier leaned back, his gaze fixed out the window. His posture was relaxed, open. Elliot mirrored it without realizing. For several minutes, they said nothing, letting the stillness fill the space. Elliot's thoughts drifted. To his husband, long gone now. To the years of silence that followed. To how different the house felt now, not louder exactly, but warmer. As if the emptiness was slowly being replaced, not by noise, but by presence. Javier's presence. There was no dramatic moment. No declaración. Just the quiet pulse of awareness growing stronger with every passing day. A loud clap of thunder broke the quiet, and Javier flinched slightly, more from surprise than fear. Elliot glanced at him, and for the first time, their eyes held. Not briefly, not accidentally. It was deliberate. focused. There was no tension in it, no urgency, just recognition. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle patter, the storm already moving east. The garden glistened beneath the new light, every surface wet and reflective. Javier stood first, setting his mug in the sink, then paused. Elliot followed, placing his cup beside Javier's. They stood in the small kitchen, close, but not touching. The air between them felt charged, not with discomfort, but with possibility. Javier gave the faintest smile, then nodded once and moved toward the door. Elliot watched him go, the damp fabric of his shirt clinging to his back. The door clicked softly behind him. That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. The house felt different. Not restless, but waiting. He wandered through the hallway, passing the window where the rain still streaked the glass. The scent of damp earth drifted in through the open vent, and he closed his eyes, imagining Javier's hands in the soil, the way he gently moved each plant to a better place. Lying in bed, Elliot tried to dismiss the feeling in his chest, the one that had started days ago and now seemed impossible to ignore. It was no longer about curiosity or gratitude. It was about connection. It was about the warmth of another soul in the same space, asking for nothing, offering everything just by being there. And beneath all of that, something had begun to bloom. The morning after the storm brought a sky scraped clean of clouds and a breeze that carried the scent of wet bark and lavender. The garden shimmered in the early light, every leaf rinsed, every flower sharpened by the rain's touch. Elliot stood at the edge of the porch, barefoot, letting the cool air wrap around his ankles. He hadn't seen Javier since the moment he left the kitchen the day before. And now, he found himself scanning the drive, his heart a quiet drum in his chest. When Javier finally appeared, just after sunrise, there was something slower in his stride. He greeted Elliot with a nod, as usual, but his eyes didn't linger. He walked past, shoulders set, eyes on the path ahead. Elliot said nothing. A knot had already started tightening in his stomach. He watched from the window as Javier began his work, methodical as always, focused, efficient. But the energy was different. The quiet between them wasn't the same calm silence they had built over the past few weeks. It felt like distance now, carefully placed. By mid-morning, Elliot walked out to the edge of the garden, pretending to check on the irrigation system, though he barely registered the dial. Javier was near the trimmed hedges, brushing mulch around the base of a bush. His back was turned. Elliot hesitated. He didn't know what he was planning to say, if anything. But the stillness between them was becoming unbearable. Eventually, Javier stood and turned to adjust a sprinkler head. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no hostility there, just guardedness, restraint, something unsaid. Elliot turned away first. The day moved on, heavy with everything they weren't addressing. The soft brush of their usual connection had gone quiet, tucked behind carefully measured movements and downcast glances. Elliot could barely concentrate on the writing he'd tried to force out. Words came, but they meant little. Each line he typed felt brittle, like it would crack if spoken aloud. Late in the afternoon, Elliot found himself in the far corner of the garden, sitting beneath the pear tree. It had become his refuge lately, a place where memories softened and the world seemed less intrusive. He listened to the rustling of the leaves, trying to ground himself. He didn't hear Javier approach, only felt the shadow as it stretched beside him, quiet and unsure. When Elliot looked up, Javier was there, standing still, waiting. There were no words at first, just the sound of wind through the branches above them. Finally, Elliot exhaled and broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, not looking directly at him. "I don't know what shifted, but it feels different now." Javier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat slowly on the grass nearby, his arms resting loosely on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the patch of soil they had cleared together the week before, now showing new signs of life. Tiny green shoots barely breaking through the earth. After a long pause, he spoke. His voice was low, thoughtful. "It's not bad, just new. That was all. And yet it was everything." Elliot looked at him fully now. In Javier's eyes, there was no accusation, only reflection, and perhaps the same uncertainty that had been twisting in Elliot's chest all day. They sat that way for a long time, the sun dipping lower, casting warm amber light through the branches. The garden around them was quiet, but not lifeless. It breathed with them, moved with them, as if it too had been waiting for a release. Eventually, Elliot leaned back, hands resting in the grass, and closed his eyes. He didn't need to speak further. The moment didn't ask for more. Javier didn't move closer, but his presence remained steady, an anchor, a quiet agreement that no matter what this was, it was real. Uncertain maybe, but real. As twilight crept in, fireflies began to appear between the hedges, small lights blinking softly against the deepening dusk. Javier stood first, brushing dirt from his pants. Elliot followed slowly. They walked back toward the house side by side, not touching but not apart. Inside, the evening settled with a kind of peace. Elliot didn't reach for the lamp. He stood at the kitchen counter, hands still flecked with soil, eyes on the darkening garden beyond the window. Behind him, Javier placed a pair of tools by the door. Their movements were quiet, domestic, natural. Before he left, Javier paused. For the first time that day, he looked directly at Elliot. No words, just a glance that held weight, and a softness that had been missing since morning. Elliot nodded slightly, and with that, Javier stepped out into the evening air. That night, Elliot didn't read. He didn't write. He sat by the window, watching the stars flicker above the trees, and let the silence fill the room again. Not with distance this time, but with something closer to hope. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, like rain softening the ground before something new could take root. Nothing between them was forced. There were no confessions, no declarations. But something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Elliot felt it in the way Javier's footsteps slowed near the porch, and how their silences had returned to comfort rather than hesitation. One morning, Elliot found a small bundle of rosemary resting on the kitchen windowsill, neatly tied with twine. He hadn't asked for it, but the scent filled the room, grounding him in a way that words couldn't. The weather grew warmer. The garden responded in kind. Blossoms opening along the stone wall, vines stretching confidently along trellises. Life, it seemed, had decided to move forward, and so had Elliot. He found himself outside more frequently now, not simply observing, but participating. Sometimes he raked or watered. Sometimes he just walked the pathways with a quiet, watchful eye. Javier worked nearby, and while they rarely spoke, their presence beside one another was no longer tentative. One afternoon, Javier arrived with an armful of tulip bulbs. Elliot met him in the garden, and without a word, crouched down beside him. The earth was warm between his fingers, soft from recent rain. Together, they began to plant. Hours passed like that, knees in the dirt, hands moving in rhythm. Occasionally their shoulders brushed, but there was no tension in it anymore. Just quiet familiarity. Elliot noticed how the light settled on Javier's skin when he tilted his head toward the sun. He noticed the way Javier's hands, so calloused and capable, handled each bulb with care, almost reverence. And with each moment, Elliot felt less like a man watching something grow and more like someone growing himself. As dusk began to stretch across the garden, Elliot stood to stretch his back. Javier remained kneeling, finishing the last row. Elliot turned to head inside, then paused. He glanced over his shoulder. "Dinner," he said softly, one of the few words spoken between them all day. Javier looked up, surprised, but nodded once. Inside, Elliot moved with a strange blend of nervousness and ease. He wasn't used to company. Not anymore. But he found himself setting the table without hesitation, lighting the small candle that hadn't been touched in years. The kitchen filled with the aroma of garlic and herbs, of warmth and something resembling welcome. Javier arrived just as the pasta finished cooking. His shirt was damp with sweat, a light dusting of dirt still on his forearm. He washed up in silence and joined Elliot at the table. The candle flickered between them. The meal was simple, but it tasted better than anything Elliot had prepared in years. They didn't talk much, just a few words here and there, comments on the garden, on the flavor of the sauce, on the weather. but beneath every sentence lay a calm current of understanding. Afterward, they moved to the back porch, each with a cup of tea in hand. The stars blinked into view one by one, scattered across a velvet sky. Crickets hummed in the distance, and the wind stirred gently through the trees. Javier sat with his hands wrapped around his mug, gazed distant but soft. Elliot sat beside him, one leg folded beneath the other, eyes fixed on the garden, on the outlines of the beds they had shaped together, the gentle sway of tall grasses in the night breeze. He didn't need to speak. He just let himself feel safe, steady seen. Eventually, Javier shifted slightly, his arm brushing Elliot's. He didn't move away. Neither of them did. The touch was not dramatic. It was not a statement or a request. It was simply there, like the breeze, like the stars, like everything else that had become part of this new, shared rhythm. Elliot looked at him. In the dim light, Javier's expression was unreadable, but his presence was full. And in that moment, Elliot felt the quiet weight of something sacred settle between them. Not passion, not urgency, but care. That night, Elliot slept with the windows open, letting the scent of rosemary and soil drift through the room. The moonlight stretched across the floor, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel alone. In the weeks that followed, the garden continued to thrive. The tulips bloomed in gentle waves of color. The pear tree bore early fruit. The air seemed fuller now, rich with life and memory and possibility. Javier came every morning. He stayed longer now, and though they never defined what had grown between them, neither man questioned it. Some things did not need explanation, like the way the earth opened when it was ready, like the way roots reached out when given the space, like the way a garden blooms when two sets of hands begin to care for it together.